The city of Rome at night was a living shadow, a place where grandeur and decay intertwined beneath the flickering light of torches. The Forum lay silent, statues of gods staring down from marble pedestals, yet the streets and hidden alleys held secrets that the official temples could never reveal. Beyond the public devotion to Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, there existed an undercurrent of worship that thrived in darkness, a devotion so forbidden that even whispers of it could incite fear and revulsion. In the silent corners of the city, in basements, caves, and abandoned villas, men and women gathered to seek salvation not through virtue or the favor of the Senate, but through the embrace of shadow itself. This was a world where darkness was not absence, but presence, where fear was transformed into ecstasy, and where transgression became a form of holiness. Initiates of these secret cults believed that the light of day, the scrutiny of the populace, and the rigid moral codes of Roman law kept them imprisoned in a limited understanding of life and death. Only by stepping into the night, into the realm where society's rules no longer applied, could one glimpse the hidden truth, a truth that promised liberation through fear, pleasure, and ultimate surrender. The psychological allure of these cults was irresistible to those disillusioned with the rigid rituals of state religion. For many, the grand temples of Rome felt cold and distant, their gods indifferent to human suffering. Public ceremonies demanded adherence, not devotion, pomp, not passion. In contrast, the cults of darkness offered something visceral and intimate, an encounter with the divine that was immediate, terrifying, and intoxicating. Here, one's mortality was confronted directly. Pain and ecstasy became gateways to understanding, and the line between damnation and salvation blurred into a seductive ambiguity. Descriptions of these cults have survived, but only in fragments, warnings written by moralists, rumors whispered by the fearful, and occasional archaeological remnants that hint at ritual and sacrifice. These sources paint a world at once alluring and horrifying, where the promise of enlightenment demanded acts so extreme that they would scandalize even the boldest of Roman senators. The allure was not merely in what was done, but in the secrecy itself, the forbidden knowledge, the hidden rites, the feeling of touching something society had deemed untouchable. Curiosity became obsession, and fear became a tool of devotion. As one imagines stepping into one of these shadowed ceremonies, the scene unfolds with almost cinematic clarity. Torches cast dancing shadows on walls carved with symbols that defied the understanding of the ordinary citizen. Incense choked the air, mingling with the earthy scent of soil, blood, and sweat. The chants were low, almost hypnotic, calling forth powers that existed beyond the moral and natural order. In that space, participants abandoned identity and ego. They became vessels, conduits for forces that were beautiful in their cruelty, terrifying in their intimacy, and irresistible in their promise of revelation. The true horror and fascination of these cults lies not just in the acts themselves, but in what they reveal about human nature. To seek salvation through darkness is to confront the deepest fears and desires that civilization teaches us to suppress. It is to explore the shadows of morality, to flirt with danger, and to question the boundaries between good and evil, pleasure and pain, life and death. Rome's shadowed worshippers were pioneers in this grim spiritual frontier, showing that the human soul, when confronted with the unknown, can embrace both terror and ecstasy in equal measure. By the end of the night, as the torches guttered and the city above slumbered, the initiates would emerge transformed. They had seen what others could not, touched what was forbidden, and in that experience, discovered a form of salvation that lay beyond fear, beyond law, and beyond society itself. It was a dark promise, one that fascinated, terrified, and left an indelible mark on the psyche. A promise that would echo through the annals of history, whispered only in shadows, yet forever inscribed in the imagination of those bold enough to wonder what lay beyond the light. Beneath the marble grandeur of Rome's public temples, there existed a pantheon of gods and spirits unknown to the common citizen, divinities that thrived in the shadows and were worshipped in secrecy. Unlike Jupiter, Mars, or Venus, whose power was sanctioned by law and celebrated in triumphal procession, these deities demanded no pomp or civic approval. They were chthonic, mysterious, and often terrifying, gods of death, chaos, and transformation whose favor could only be won through acts that society called immoral or unthinkable. Their allure was profound. In a city obsessed with order and hierarchy, these shadowed gods promised freedom, power, and salvation through darkness, a communion beyond the reach of mortal law. The psychological pull of these gods cannot be overstated. For the Roman elite, whose lives were rigidly structured by politics, honor, and public scrutiny, the cults offered a space where social constraints evaporated. Wealth, status, and reputation, so meticulously guarded in daylight, became meaningless under the veil of night. The gods of darkness were not distant or indifferent. They were intimate, omnipresent, and exacting. Their worship required total surrender, a willingness to transgress moral boundaries, and a courage to face fear and mortality head-on. In return, they promised a form of salvation far more potent than any blessing granted by the temples of the Forum. Historical accounts hint at the diversity of these deities. Some were inspired by Greek chthonic figures, Hades, Nyx, and Thanatos, adapted to Roman understanding and suffused with local ritual nuance. Others were wholly Roman inventions, secret spirits whose names were never spoken in daylight, whose likenesses existed only in cryptic symbols scratched into walls or carved into amulets. Some were gods of transformation, demanding initiates undergo symbolic deaths or mutilations to be reborn into spiritual enlightenment. Others were gods of vengeance and power, granting protection and insight to those bold enough to offer blood, loyalty, or transgression as sacrifice. Together, they formed a shadowed pantheon that existed parallel to, yet completely outside, the sanctioned religion of Rome. Archaeological evidence, though fragmentary, offers chilling glimpses of their worship. Hidden altars have been found beneath villas and in subterranean chambers, decorated with obscure symbols and small, carefully arranged offerings of food, wine, or small animals. Inscriptions hint at vows and prayers that speak of deliverance through darkness, of salvation not in life, but beyond it. Graffiti scrawled on walls sometimes records names of gods never mentioned in official texts, alongside cryptic messages that suggest initiation and ritual. The physical traces of these cults are sparse, yet they resonate with a sense of secrecy, devotion, and an almost tangible presence of fear and awe. Ancient moralists, fearful of these secret cults, describe them in stark terms. To Roman philosophers and senators, they were not merely deviant or immoral, they were existentially threatening. The gods of darkness inverted the societal order. Power came not from birth, wealth, or office, but from daring to confront fear, to embrace the taboo, and to transgress laws both divine and human. The allure of these gods lay precisely in that inversion. To worship them was to step outside the comfortable certainty of public morality and confront the raw, unfiltered forces that governed life, death, and the unknown. The relationship between initiate and God was intensely personal. These deities were not remote figures, indifferent to sacrifice or ritual. They demanded presence, attention, and devotion. Initiates reported visions, dreams, and experiences that mainstream religion could not provide. Encounters with darkness as a living entity, feelings of merging with shadow, and sensations of power drawn directly from the unseen world. Unlike Jupiter or Mars, whose favor was mediated through ritual spectacle, augury, or political patronage, these gods were immediate and transformative. The spiritual intimacy created both obsession and terror, forging bonds between mortal and divine that were impossible to sever once established. Contrast is central to understanding their appeal. By day, Rome celebrated light, reason, and civic order. By night, the cults offered darkness, mystery, and the forbidden. The same city that glorified military triumphs, public games, and domestic morality hid a parallel world where limits were dissolved, fears confronted, and pleasures transgressive became sacred acts. Beauty coexisted with cruelty, ecstasy coexisted with terror, devotion coexisted with moral transgression. The gods of darkness embodied this duality, promising the ultimate reward to those who could endure and embrace it. The cults also served as psychological laboratories, testing the limits of human experience. Pain, fear, pleasure, and moral inversion were not arbitrary. They were tools to strip away ego, societal conditioning, and attachment to the material world. In doing so, initiates could approach the divine in ways that public religion never allowed. The gods of darkness demanded surrender, not merely in ritual, but in thought, desire, and identity. To be chosen, or to choose willingly, was to accept a life forever altered, a mind forever stretched, a soul forever engaged with the shadows. Ultimately, these gods were seductive because they offered a promise that official religion never could: power over fear, insight into the mysteries of life and death, and salvation not in conformity, but in confrontation. They were the embodiment of forbidden curiosity, the living answer to the question that every Roman might have whispered to themselves in private: what lies beyond the light, and what price would I pay to touch it? In exploring these gods, the secret cults of Rome revealed not only their devotion to darkness but also the depths of human longing, courage, and obsession, and in doing so, left a legacy of fascination, horror, and awe that endures to this day. Initiation into the secret cults of Rome was not merely a ceremonial formality, it was a transformative journey, a passage from the ordinary into the extraordinary, from fear into a strange, intoxicating ecstasy. For those chosen, or those bold enough to volunteer, the path began with secrecy, a threshold that separated the light of the world from the darkness of the unknown. The city above slept under the watchful gaze of Jupiter, but below, in hidden chambers, abandoned villas, and natural caves, the air pulsed with anticipation, dread, and the scent of incense, blood, and earth. The night became a realm of possibility, a place where societal rules dissolved, and the divine could be approached not through ritualistic civility but through extremity, transgression, and surrender. The initiation process was designed to strip the initiate of identity, ego, and social conditioning, leaving only raw humanity exposed to divine scrutiny. In the earliest stages, recruits were often subjected to psychological tests, blindfolded and led through darkened passages, made to confront fears both real and symbolic. They were told stories of gods who demanded everything, gods who thrived on the courage and suffering of their devotees. Every step into the unknown was a deliberate act of control and submission, a confrontation with mortality, desire, and taboo. The darkness became both literal and metaphorical, a teacher, a gatekeeper, and a mirror to the soul. As the ritual deepened, sensory manipulation intensified. The faint flicker of torchlight created dancing shadows that seemed alive, twisting on the walls like monstrous, hypnotic specters. Low chants, monotone and resonant, vibrated through the chamber, syncing with the heartbeat of the initiate and fostering a trance-like state. Incense and smoke obscured vision, disorienting the senses, while the subtle use of intoxicating herbs heightened perception, blurring the line between reality and vision. In this environment, fear, awe, and desire intertwined so completely that the initiate's mind became a fertile ground for revelation, suggestion, and spiritual transformation. Physical trials often accompanied psychological ones. Some cults demanded acts of self-mortification or endurance, the holding of painful postures, symbolic wounds, or temporary deprivation of food and water. Others involved witnessing or participating in acts considered morally or socially transgressive, such as ritualized sexual activity, minor bloodletting, or symbolic offerings to chthonic deities. The purpose was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was to break the attachment to the mundane, to sever the ego, and to open the initiate to the divine energy believed to dwell in shadow, fear, and transgression. Each act was framed as a step closer to illumination, a necessary ordeal to confront the ultimate truth hidden from ordinary life. The psychological mechanics of initiation were as deliberate as the physical rituals. Fear was cultivated and then transformed into exhilaration. Shame was confronted and transmuted into power. Curiosity was pushed into obsession. In this way, the initiates learned to navigate extremes of emotion, embracing both horror and ecstasy as parts of a sacred journey. Many historians suggest that this intense manipulation of the mind created lasting devotion. Once an individual had crossed the threshold, the pull of the cult was irresistible. The darkness became addictive, and the initiates were bound not only to the deity but to the community of the secret, the thrill of transgression, and the knowledge of the forbidden. The structure of initiation often involved layers of secrecy and symbolism. Each act, chant, or offering had multiple meanings, some public to the cult, others hidden even from participants until they reached higher levels of understanding. The higher one advanced, the more extreme the tests became, the more profound the revelations, and the greater the psychological and spiritual commitment required. It was a hierarchy not of social status, but of courage, endurance, and willingness to confront the unimaginable. In this way, the cult ensured that those who reached its inner sanctums were transformed irreversibly, their minds and souls intimately attuned to the gods of shadow. One of the most haunting aspects of these initiations was the deliberate use of contrast: light versus darkness, life versus death, pleasure versus pain. Initiates were forced to confront the fragility of their own existence, often through symbolic death rituals. In some accounts, recruits were laid in small pits or coffins, blindfolded and left in darkness, forced to meditate on mortality and the transitory nature of human life. In other cases, they were made to witness the sacrifice of animals, or to simulate acts of transgression, so that the line between the sacred and the profane became ambiguous. The effect was profound. Fear and awe became intertwined, creating a psychological intensity that modern observers can scarcely imagine. It is crucial to understand that these initiation rites were not random acts of brutality, they were carefully crafted spiritual experiences. Every element was designed to awaken a sense of presence, to confront the participant with mortality, desire, and forbidden knowledge, and to forge a direct, transformative relationship with the gods of darkness. To emerge from initiation was to emerge changed. The ordinary world now seemed limited, moral constraints artificial, and the hidden forces of life, death, and divinity intimately real. The secrecy of the cults amplified their power. Initiates could speak of their experiences only to those who had shared them. Failure to observe silence was met with threats, ostracism, or ritualized punishment. This secrecy heightened the psychological intensity, as the unknown became more terrifying, alluring, and sacred. The forbidden knowledge, once glimpsed, created a lifelong obsession, and the darkness itself became a symbol of salvation, power, and ultimate freedom from societal constraints. By the end of initiation, the recruit had crossed a threshold. No longer merely a citizen of Rome, they had become part of a hidden world, intimately connected to forces invisible to the rest of society. Fear had been confronted, boundaries transgressed, and the ego transformed. Pain and ecstasy, moral transgression and spiritual awakening, all coexisted in a single, overwhelming experience. In embracing the darkness, the initiates glimpsed salvation, a forbidden promise that would haunt them, empower them, and bind them to the cult for the rest of their lives. These rites, terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure, reveal much about human psychology, desire, and obsession. They show that the promise of hidden knowledge and power can outweigh the fear of death, social condemnation, and moral corruption. The initiates of Roman shadow cults were drawn into a world where darkness itself became sacred, fear became enlightenment, and the boundaries of morality and divinity dissolved into a single, haunting, and unforgettable experience. The secret cults of Rome were not merely spaces for fear and initiation, they were arenas where the boundaries of morality, pleasure, and devotion were deliberately blurred. At the heart of their most esoteric rituals lay acts that would horrify ordinary citizens: sacred sexual rites, blood offerings, and bodily transgressions, all framed as acts of ultimate worship. In these ceremonies, ecstasy and terror intertwined so completely that the participants often could not distinguish between devotion and indulgence, between horror and liberation. The public temples, with their marble columns and official priesthoods, emphasized order, ritual, and distance from the body. Here, in the shadowed chambers and moonlit groves, the body became the instrument of the divine, and every act of transgression was a prayer, every moment of pleasure a sacrament. Descriptions of these rites are fragmentary, coming from the writings of moralists, satirical poets, and gossiping senators who feared what they could not understand. Yet the evidence, when pieced together, suggests a ritual logic that was as deliberate as it was shocking. Initiates would be drawn into intimate acts that simulated the cycles of life, death, and rebirth, sometimes involving sexual coupling, symbolic offerings of bodily fluids, or ritualized contact that mirrored cosmic or chthonic energies. These acts were not indulgences for their own sake, they were understood as sacred channels, conduits for divine energy and transformation. The line between sin and sanctity, pleasure and punishment, dissolved entirely. One of the most chilling aspects of these ceremonies was their psychological intensity. Sexual acts, in the context of darkness, incense, and hypnotic chanting, became rites of terror and ecstasy simultaneously. Participants were trained to confront shame, to embrace vulnerability, and to surrender entirely to the ritual. The human body became a site of both suffering and transcendence. Pain was not merely tolerated, it was embraced, sharpened into awareness, and transformed into a means of accessing the divine. Pleasure and pain became inseparable. The sensation of one heightened the perception of the other, creating an emotional intensity that few outside the cult could imagine. Blood, too, played a central role. Not always in the extreme sense of human sacrifice, but often in symbolic offerings, small cuts, animal blood, or ritualized wounds that connected the initiate to life's fundamental fragility. The act of drawing blood was a reminder of mortality, a bridge between human limitation and divine power. Roman moralists recoiled at the thought, describing these practices as abhorrent and unnatural, but for initiates, they were deeply sacred. The combination of fear, pain, and erotic energy created a psychological crucible in which the ordinary self was stripped away, leaving a consciousness attuned to the gods of shadow. Sexuality in these cults was not merely physical, it was profoundly symbolic. Couples often mirrored the dynamics of cosmic forces, masculine and feminine, life and death, chaos and order. Each act was a reenactment of divine principles, encoded in secrecy and understood only by those initiated into the mysteries. In some accounts, participants engaged in role reversals, masking, and ritualized transgressions designed to upend ordinary power dynamics and social hierarchies. By embracing these inversions, the initiate demonstrated courage, devotion, and the willingness to confront fear, shame, and desire simultaneously. The psychological effect was transformative, moral boundaries were dissolved, and a profound sense of connection to the divine darkness was cultivated. The allure of these rites also lay in their secrecy. Public exposure would have meant disgrace, prosecution, or even death. This danger heightened the intensity of the experience. The act of participating in something forbidden, in direct defiance of societal norms, created a bond between initiates and their gods that was almost unbreakable. Fear of discovery, mixed with pleasure and awe, intensified devotion. The darkness was not just a metaphor, it was the environment that made the sacred tangible, the thrill of risk transforming ordinary acts into rites of transcendence. The sensory environment amplified this effect. Moonlight filtering through cracks, flickering torches casting elongated shadows, and the hypnotic rhythm of chants created a liminal space where reality itself seemed mutable. Initiates were encouraged to lose their ordinary selves, surrendering identity and ego in the service of the divine. Some cults even employed intoxicating herbs or powders to heighten the intensity of sensation, blurring the line between consciousness and hallucination. In this altered state, every act, every brush of skin, every whispered chant, every bead of blood, became monumental, charged with cosmic significance. Historical observers noted the terrifying combination of allure and revulsion these rituals produced. Roman senators and moralists wrote of young men and women abandoning all propriety, drawn by promises of power, immortality, or spiritual liberation. Poets mocked, philosophers condemned, and legal authorities feared the spread of these practices. Yet the secrecy and intensity of the rites ensured their persistence. For those who experienced them, the rewards, psychological transformation, spiritual empowerment, and an intimate encounter with divinity far outweighed the risks. These rituals were not entertainment, they were initiation into a philosophy that embraced the darkest aspects of human nature as pathways to enlightenment. The underlying psychology was profound. Pleasure, pain, fear, and devotion were deliberately entwined to create a heightened state of consciousness. Initiates learned to confront shame without avoidance, desire without guilt, and fear without paralysis. Through repeated exposure to these extremes, they cultivated what modern psychologists might describe as an altered state of moral and emotional perception, in which ordinary rules no longer applied and divine forces could be perceived directly. In this sense, the sexual and bloody rites of Roman shadow cults were as much about mental transformation as they were about physical or spiritual devotion. Ultimately, these rites reveal the paradoxical nature of human fascination with the forbidden. The acts themselves, horrifying to the uninitiated, were revered as paths to salvation by those who participated. Beauty and horror, ecstasy and terror, pleasure and pain existed simultaneously in these secret ceremonies, demonstrating the profound complexity of human devotion. The cults of Rome understood something fundamental about the human psyche, that the most extreme experiences, the most transgressive acts, can create not only fear but awe, not only horror but spiritual awakening. By the conclusion of these rituals, participants emerged irrevocably changed. Ordinary life, social expectations, and even conventional morality seemed diminished, incapable of containing the intensity of the truths they had glimpsed. The intertwining of sex, blood, and devotion had forged a direct connection with the gods of darkness, a communion that was both terrifying and intoxicating. For the initiates, the world of light and order became secondary, the world of shadow, secrecy, and extreme devotion had become their true reality. In this way, the most forbidden acts became the most sacred, a chilling testament to the power of darkness as a conduit for human transcendence. Some cults in Rome took their devotion to darkness even further, reserving their rituals exclusively for the night. These were not ordinary ceremonies that merely happened to occur after sunset. Night itself was sacred, a liminal space where the gods of shadow could be encountered directly, unmediated by the glare of the sun, the watchful eyes of authorities, or the rigid morality of day-bound society. For the cult's initiates, the night was both teacher and protector, providing concealment and amplifying the psychological power of every act. In this realm, fear was sharpened, perception intensified, and the line between reality and divine vision dissolved. Nocturnal rituals often took place in locations carefully chosen for their isolation and symbolism. Natural caves outside the city, abandoned villas hidden behind dense groves, and subterranean chambers beneath ordinary homes became sanctuaries of darkness. The entrance to these spaces was typically concealed, often requiring initiates to navigate treacherous terrain, dark tunnels, or ritualized trials before even entering the sacred area. Every step heightened anticipation and vulnerability, making the final encounter with the divine all the more intense. Darkness itself became an instrument of spiritual transformation, a force to be revered and feared in equal measure. The ceremonies themselves were immersive experiences. Torches flickered, casting long, moving shadows that seemed almost alive, stretching across walls and floors like dark specters. The air was thick with incense and smoke, carrying the scents of herbs, animal oils, and occasionally blood. Chants, low and resonant, filled the space, vibrating against stone walls and penetrating deep into the minds of the participants. These sounds, combined with the sensory deprivation of the darkened environment, induced a trance-like state, allowing the initiate to experience heightened perception, profound fear, and ecstatic awe simultaneously. In these moments, the gods of the night were no longer distant concepts. They were present, immediate, and intimate. The psychological structure of nocturnal rituals was deliberate and intense. Fear was not an incidental byproduct. It was a tool. Initiates were led through acts that pushed them to confront their deepest anxieties, the possibility of death, the fragility of the human body, and the moral boundaries that governed their everyday lives. Some cults simulated death through enclosed, coffin-like chambers, blindfolded darkness, or symbolic rites where participants were killed and reborn within the ritual space. Others demanded witnessing acts of sacrifice, whether animal or symbolic, as a means of confronting mortality directly. The purpose was to dissolve ordinary perception, leaving the mind open to the sacred and terrifying presence of the divine. The interplay of secrecy, danger, and intimacy intensified the spiritual effect. Unlike public temples where ritual was regulated and predictable, night rituals thrived on unpredictability and risk. Initiates were acutely aware that discovery could mean social ruin, legal punishment, or physical harm. This ever-present danger heightened the intensity of experience, making every touch, glance, or whispered chant feel charged with significance. The darkness magnified emotions. Joy became ecstasy, fear became awe, and the mundane became sacred. In this sense, the night was not simply a backdrop. It was an active participant in the ritual, shaping perception and amplifying devotion. Sexuality, already a central component in many cults, took on unique dimensions in nocturnal ceremonies. Acts of intimacy were framed as cosmic mirrors, representing the balance of life and death, creation and destruction, chaos and order. Masks, veils, and symbolic role reversals enhanced the psychological intensity, removing individual identity and transforming participants into vessels of divine energy. In some accounts, couples were instructed to reenact mythic narratives of gods or chthonic spirits, blending pleasure and devotion into a single, ecstatic act. The result was a profound intertwining of the human and the divine, where moral boundaries were suspended and the body became a sacred instrument of connection. Animal sacrifices were also common in nocturnal rituals, conducted not as spectacles but as intimate, symbolic acts. The blood was believed to nourish the gods of the night, while the act of witnessing or participating in sacrifice heightened the initiate's awareness of life, death, and the fragility of human existence. In some cults, small symbolic offerings, such as cuts, incisions, or the pouring of wine over altars, served as substitutes for larger sacrifices, maintaining the psychological and spiritual intensity without escalating physical risk. Every element, no matter how minor, was calculated to produce maximum engagement with fear, awe, and devotion. Perhaps most chilling was the deliberate creation of ambiguity. Within these nocturnal rituals, the initiate could never be certain where performance ended and reality began, where simulation ended and genuine spiritual encounter began. Shadows became indistinct shapes, chants blended with whispers of memory or imagination, and the faint glow of torches transformed ordinary walls into landscapes of divine presence. This ambiguity forced the mind to engage fully, amplifying psychological intensity and leaving participants acutely aware of the sacred and forbidden forces surrounding them. Fear and ecstasy merged, and in this fusion, a sense of connection to the gods of darkness was achieved. The nocturnal cults also fostered a profound sense of community. Initiates were bound together by secrecy, shared terror, and collective devotion. Unlike public religious ceremonies, which emphasized individual morality or civic duty, these rituals demanded trust, intimacy, and mutual reliance. Every participant became a witness, a collaborator, and a guardian of the sacred mysteries. The psychological bonds formed in the darkness were almost inextricable, further anchoring participants to the cult and deepening their devotion to the gods they worshipped. Ultimately, the nocturnal rituals of Rome's shadow cults reveal the extraordinary power of darkness in human spirituality. By retreating from light, the initiates confronted the raw, unfiltered forces of fear, desire, and mortality. The night transformed ordinary actions into acts of transcendence, blurred moral boundaries into sacred pathways, and allowed human beings to experience the divine in ways inaccessible to those bound by daylight and societal law. Beauty and horror, pleasure and terror, life and death were fused into a single, intoxicating experience that left participants forever changed. For the initiates, night was not merely a time of secrecy, it was salvation itself. In the shadows, the gods of darkness were present, the forbidden became holy, and fear became the vehicle of enlightenment. The city above slept in ignorance, unaware of the profound transformations occurring beneath the moonlit sky. And for those who emerged from these nocturnal rites, the experience was indelible, a lifelong connection to forces that existed beyond morality, beyond law, and beyond the comprehension of ordinary mortals. The darkness was sacred, and to embrace it fully was to glimpse the divine. Fear was the most powerful tool in the arsenal of Rome's secret cults, and for initiates, it was not a byproduct of ritual, it was the ritual itself. These cults understood something profoundly human. Terror, when controlled and framed as sacred, could become a gateway to transcendence. In the shadows of hidden temples, subterranean chambers, and moonlit groves, fear was meticulously orchestrated. The sights, sounds, and sensations of ritual were designed to destabilize the mind, heighten perception, and push initiates to confront their most primal anxieties. In this world, terror was not punishment, it was instruction, purification, and a bridge to communion with the gods of darkness. The architecture of fear was deliberate. Initiates were often placed in environments that heightened vulnerability, narrow tunnels, enclosed chambers, or spaces lit only by flickering torches that cast monstrous shadows across walls. The darkness became a living presence, amplifying imagination and suggestion. Chants, drums, and rhythmic sounds reverberated through the spaces, creating a physical vibration that synchronized with the heartbeat, intensifying the emotional and psychological impact. In some cults, the fear was compounded by the uncertainty of what would come next, unexpected touches, whispers, or the sudden appearance of masked figures. Every sensory cue was a reminder of the unknown, a reminder that the gods of shadow were near and demanded absolute attention and surrender. Physical trials often accompanied psychological manipulation. Initiates were made to endure extremes of discomfort, standing in icy water, fasting for hours, or holding painful postures for long durations. Some were subjected to symbolic threats of death or exposure to mock violence, forcing a confrontation with mortality itself. These experiences were terrifying, yet they served a sacred purpose: to strip away ego, attachment, and the illusion of control. By facing the very real possibility of pain or death, initiates learned to surrender, to trust the ritual, and to embrace the divine power that lurked in darkness. Blood, both symbolic and literal, was frequently incorporated into these rituals, further intensifying fear. The sight of an animal sacrifice, the sting of a ritual cut, or the smell of copper-rich blood in the air created a visceral confrontation with mortality. It was a reminder of the fragility of life and the immediacy of death, a confrontation that was terrifying yet deeply sacred. The psychological effect was profound. Fear became intertwined with awe, horror became a medium of devotion, and every act of courage within the ritual reinforced the initiate's connection to the gods. Perhaps the most psychologically potent aspect of these rites was the deliberate blurring of reality and illusion. Initiates were often placed in situations where they could not distinguish between what was real and what was symbolic, between performance and divine encounter. A flicker of shadow might seem alive, a whisper in the darkness might carry the voice of a deity, and a sudden movement might feel like the presence of a spirit. This ambiguity forced the mind to fully engage, heightening perception, emotional intensity, and spiritual receptivity. Fear became a tool to open the mind, to dissolve ordinary perception, and to create a heightened sense of communion with the sacred. The role of community within these terrifying experiences was equally crucial. Initiates were rarely alone. Each participant was surrounded by others who shared the same vulnerability, fear, and devotion. This collective experience amplified the psychological intensity, creating bonds of trust and shared terror. Witnessing another participant confront fear, or endure pain for the sake of devotion, inspired courage and deepened commitment. In this way, the cult transformed fear from an individual struggle into a communal journey, where the power of darkness was experienced collectively and devotion was reinforced by shared vulnerability. Fear was also moral and psychological. The initiates confronted taboos, transgressions, and forbidden acts, learning to navigate the tension between societal morality and sacred transgression. Every act that violated public norms, whether sexual, violent, or symbolic, was imbued with spiritual significance. The initiate's mind was stretched, challenged, and ultimately transformed. Shame, guilt, and moral anxiety became tools for spiritual awakening. In this sense, fear was not only of physical danger or death, it was fear of self, fear of the forbidden, and fear of confronting the deepest desires and anxieties of the human psyche. The symbolic use of fear extended to role-playing and ritualized suffering. Some cults reenacted mythic narratives of gods who endured torment, death, or betrayal. Initiates were made to mirror these experiences, whether through symbolic crucifixion, simulated wounds, or trials of endurance. By embodying the suffering of divine figures, participants internalized the lessons of resilience, submission, and transcendence. Fear became a bridge, connecting human vulnerability with divine power, teaching that courage and devotion could transform terror into salvation. It was not merely the extremes of experience that produced transformation, but the rhythm and structure of the ritual. The alternation of fear and relief, terror and calm, heightened and diminished sensation, created a psychological roller coaster that intensified emotional and spiritual engagement. The initiate moved between moments of paralyzing dread and ecstatic release, learning to navigate extremes of emotion while remaining present to the sacred. This rhythmic orchestration of terror and relief was a key component of the cult's psychological sophistication, ensuring that the lessons of fear were deeply internalized. Philosophers and moralists of the time recoiled at these practices, describing them as madness, depravity, or sacrilege. Yet the initiates experienced a different reality, a reality in which fear was not the enemy, but the teacher, horror was not punishment, but communion, and surrender was not weakness, but power. In confronting the unknown and the terrifying, they discovered a profound sense of mastery, not over the external world, but over themselves. The gods of darkness rewarded those who could endure, those who could embrace fear without fleeing, and those who could transform horror into spiritual insight. Ultimately, the art of fear in Rome's shadow cults reveals a profound understanding of human psychology. These cults recognized that terror, when framed as sacred, could awaken capacities of perception, devotion, and courage that ordinary life never demanded. Fear was a tool, a gateway, and a teacher, a force that revealed both the fragility and the resilience of the human soul. By confronting the most extreme aspects of existence, the initiates glimpsed truths inaccessible to those who remained in the comfort of light, safety, and conventional morality. In the end, terror became salvation. Pain, horror, and fear were not obstacles. They were the crucible in which devotion was forged and insight was revealed. Initiates emerged transformed, their minds sharpened, their spirits attuned to the hidden forces of life and death, and their souls bound to the gods of darkness. What society condemned as perversion or madness, the cults experienced as revelation, a direct encounter with the divine through the most primal human emotions. In this way, fear was elevated to a sacred art, a path to enlightenment, and a bridge between mortality and the shadowed realm of the gods. For the secret cults of Rome, the ultimate act of devotion often came in the form of sacrifice. These were not public offerings performed in daylight for the approval of the Senate or the plebeians. These were intimate, hidden, and profoundly terrifying acts, believed to bridge the mortal and the divine. Blood, whether of animals, symbolic substitutes, or, in the most extreme and rare cases, humans, was seen as a conduit of life and a medium through which the gods of darkness could be approached. The act of offering was not merely a ritual, it was a transgression that elevated fear, courage, and devotion to a sacred plane, demanding total surrender from the initiate. The rituals surrounding sacrifice were designed with meticulous care. Participants were often led into shadowed chambers or secluded groves, spaces deliberately chosen for their isolation and their ability to amplify psychological tension. The air was heavy with incense, smoke, and the metallic tang of blood. Flickering torches cast twisted shadows across the walls, making every movement seem alive, every gesture imbued with significance. Chants, low and rhythmic, resonated through the space, vibrating through bone and muscle alike, merging with the heartbeat of both the human and the sacrificed animal. The sensory overload served to heighten fear and awe, ensuring that every act carried maximum emotional and spiritual impact. Animal sacrifices were the most common and the most socially acceptable of these hidden rites, yet they were no less intense. Birds, goats, or small domesticated animals were carefully prepared, their deaths framed as offerings to chthonic deities who demanded life as the price for insight. The blood was considered sacred, sometimes collected and poured over altars or participants, sometimes smeared on symbols carved into stone or walls. For the initiates, witnessing or participating in these acts was a confrontation with mortality, a direct encounter with the fragility of life, and an intense psychological experience that bound them to the divine. In rarer instances, the cults were rumored to engage in human sacrifice, though evidence remains fragmentary and often comes from the accounts of moralists eager to sensationalize or condemn. Whether these acts were symbolic, simulated, or literal, the fear they instilled in initiates was very real. Even the suggestion of human blood as a medium of devotion reinforced the power of ritual, elevating the psychological stakes. Participants were forced to confront the ultimate taboo, the taking of life, the surrender to forces beyond comprehension, and the acceptance that the gods demanded absolute devotion, sometimes at the highest possible cost. Symbolism permeated every aspect of these sacrifices. The act of shedding blood represented the vulnerability of the human body, the fragility of life, and the surrender of the ego to the divine. Animals or symbolic offerings stood in for human impermanence, and the ritual itself became a meditation on mortality. Participants often entered a trance-like state, experiencing fear, awe, and ecstasy simultaneously, feeling themselves both insignificant and intimately connected to cosmic forces. The psychological intensity of this act was such that, for many initiates, it became the defining spiritual experience of their lives. The secrecy surrounding these sacrifices amplified their power. Unlike public temple offerings, which were regulated, predictable, and ceremonial, these rituals existed in the shadows, unobserved by society and unknown to law. Every moment carried the tension of potential discovery, of social and legal repercussions, creating a heightened state of alertness and vulnerability. This awareness magnified emotional intensity, turning fear into devotion and danger into a spiritual tool. The risk of exposure became part of the sacred calculus, reinforcing the transformative power of the rite. Sacrificial rituals were also deeply tied to the cyclical understanding of life, death, and rebirth. Blood was not merely an offering. It was a symbol of the perpetual motion of existence, a link between mortal fragility and divine immortality. By participating in these rituals, initiates sought to align themselves with the rhythm of the universe, to access knowledge and power beyond the reach of ordinary human experience. Life and death, horror and ecstasy, fear and devotion merged into a single, overwhelming experience that reshaped perception, morality, and consciousness. The communal aspect of sacrifice was also critical. While the act itself was intimate, often involving only a few participants and the officiating priest, it created bonds between those involved. Shared fear, shared risk, and shared participation in acts of moral and physical transgression forged intense psychological connections. These connections reinforced loyalty, secrecy, and devotion, ensuring that initiates remained committed not only to the gods but to the hidden community itself. Fear, danger, and awe became tools of cohesion as much as they were tools of spiritual transformation. Some cults incorporated simulated or symbolic human sacrifices to heighten psychological intensity without the logistical or moral complications of actual homicide. Participants might be mocked into symbolic death, enveloped in darkness, or subjected to ritualized trauma designed to mimic the finality of mortality. Even in simulation, the act was profoundly transformative. The fear of transgression, the confrontation with mortality, and the intense focus on the sacred elevated consciousness and created a lasting impression of divine presence. The ritual's power lay not solely in physical acts but in the psychological, emotional, and spiritual immersion it induced. The historical record, though sparse and often sensationalized, emphasizes the duality of these rituals. They were terrifying and exhilarating, sacred and transgressive, horrifying and illuminating. The shedding of blood, whether symbolic or literal, was a confrontation with the fundamental truths of existence. Life is fragile, death is inevitable, and true communion with the divine requires courage, devotion, and surrender. These sacrifices exemplified the philosophy of the shadow cults, which embraced extremes of experience as pathways to transcendence and illumination. Ultimately, the secret sacrifices of Rome's shadow cults reveal the dark sophistication of human devotion. Participants confronted fear, mortality, and taboo simultaneously, using acts of ritualized transgression to forge a direct connection with forces beyond ordinary comprehension. Blood became sacred, danger became transformative, and horror became a medium of divine communication. In this way, what society condemned as madness or depravity became, for initiates, a profound encounter with the sacred, a visceral, terrifying, and unforgettable pathway to salvation. The secret cults of Rome, despite their hidden sanctuaries and shadowed rituals, were never entirely immune to the scrutiny of the wider society. Rumors of forbidden rites, blood offerings, and nocturnal gatherings reached the ears of magistrates, senators, and moralists, igniting fear, suspicion, and moral panic. These cults, thriving in secrecy, were seen as a threat not only to social order but to the very fabric of Roman morality. The possibility that citizens were surrendering themselves to powers beyond control, performing acts that transgressed law and nature, became a source of obsession for authorities and chroniclers alike. Persecution and paranoia followed in tandem, each feeding the other, creating a climate of tension, terror, and clandestine vigilance. Accusations were often dramatic and exaggerated, emphasizing the most transgressive rumors. Moralists claimed that worshippers indulged in forbidden sexual acts, drew blood in the name of gods, or engaged in human sacrifice. These reports were sometimes rooted in truth but often amplified to shock the public and justify intervention. Yet the secrecy of the cults made verification impossible. Initiates could neither confirm nor deny the rumors, and the very inability to penetrate these shadowed communities heightened the fear surrounding them. Mystery, danger, and speculation converged, magnifying paranoia and giving the cults an almost mythic reputation. Persecution was not uniform, nor was it always overt. Some cults were quietly tolerated, particularly if they remained distant from public life or drew adherents from the elite, whose influence offered a degree of protection. Others faced harsh suppression, raids, or social ostracism. Legal measures, religious edicts, and moral condemnations sought to eradicate what was perceived as spiritual contamination. Even the mere suspicion of involvement could result in exile, imprisonment, or execution, underscoring the high stakes of participation. Fear of discovery added another layer of intensity to the cult's rituals, as secrecy became not just a spiritual requirement but a practical necessity for survival. The psychological impact of persecution on initiates was profound. Living under the constant threat of exposure heightened emotional intensity and strengthened devotion. Fear of discovery, shame, and moral conflict were transformed into sacred tension, reinforcing the bonds between members and deepening their commitment to the gods of darkness. Every ritual became an act of defiance and survival, every secret whispered a reinforcement of identity and courage. In this way, persecution inadvertently enhanced the power of the cults, making devotion more visceral, loyalty more absolute, and fear a tool for spiritual transformation rather than mere punishment. Paranoia also extended beyond external threats to the internal dynamics of the cults themselves. Initiates were constantly tested for loyalty, discretion, and courage. Betrayal, even accidental, could have dire consequences, creating an atmosphere of vigilance, suspicion, and psychological intensity. The interplay of fear, secrecy, and devotion produced a heightened state of awareness, sharpening both the mind and the spirit. Initiates learned to navigate danger, deception, and moral ambiguity, gaining skills and psychological resilience that became part of the transformative power of their worship. Despite, or perhaps because of, the risks, the allure of the cults persisted. Persecution made the forbidden more enticing. The very acts that were condemned by society became more sacred in the eyes of the initiates. Fear of exposure intensified the thrill of secrecy and deepened the spiritual significance of every ritual. Darkness, transgression, and danger were no longer merely symbolic. They were lived realities that magnified the psychological and spiritual potency of worship. In this way, paranoia and persecution became part of the sacred architecture of devotion, shaping rituals, experiences, and the very identity of those involved. Historical accounts, often written by outsiders, emphasize the tension between fascination and condemnation. Chroniclers relished the horror and moral outrage of these cults, painting lurid images of nocturnal debauchery and blood rites. Yet beneath the sensationalism lies a recognition of the transformative power of secrecy, fear, and devotion. The cults thrived precisely because they operated in the shadows, navigating the tension between mortal authority and divine mystery, between danger and ecstasy. The very persecution they faced became part of their mythology, a crucible that forged courage, obsession, and unwavering loyalty. Ultimately, the intersection of persecution and paranoia illuminates the complex psychology of Rome's shadow cults. The fear of exposure, both from external authorities and internal tests, heightened the intensity of experience and reinforced the sacred significance of every act. Danger became a medium of devotion, secrecy a pathway to spiritual intimacy, and paranoia a tool of transformation. In embracing the threat of persecution, initiates deepened their connection to the gods of darkness, navigating terror, risk, and transgression to achieve experiences unattainable in the ordinary world. The legacy of this tension is enduring. The shadow cults, hidden from public view yet vivid in rumor and imagination, reveal how fear, secrecy, and moral panic can shape human devotion, psychological intensity, and spiritual experience. Where society saw danger and corruption, initiates found transcendence, mastery over fear, and communion with forces beyond mortal comprehension. Persecution was not merely an external challenge, it was woven into the very fabric of their practice, transforming terror into a sacred, unforgettable path toward enlightenment, obsession, and awe. The shadow cults of Rome, those secretive assemblies devoted to darkness, mystery, and the forbidden, have long vanished from the historical record. Yet their echoes persist, not in stone or manuscript, but in the imagination, in whispered rumors, and in the dark corners of human curiosity. They were more than clandestine societies. They were laboratories of the human soul, arenas where morality, fear, desire, and devotion were tested to their absolute limits. In the hidden chambers beneath Rome, in moonlit groves far from the gaze of the public, initiates learned lessons that society would never sanction, lessons that forced them to confront the extremities of life, death, and the divine. To those who took part, the world above, the sunlit streets, the orderly temples, the codified laws, was only half of reality. Below, in the shadows, existed a realm that was both terrifying and intoxicating, horrifying and sacred, where salvation was found not through obedience but through transgression. The psychological impact of these rituals was profound. Initiates faced terror as a tool of enlightenment, pain as a medium of communion, and darkness as a pathway to the divine. The human mind, unshielded by societal norms or daylight, became a canvas upon which fear, desire, and devotion painted their most vivid, unsettling strokes. Each act of ritual, whether it involved symbolic sacrifice, sexual transgression, or the endurance of pain, was designed to dissolve the ego and strip away the layers of ordinary perception. In the suffocating darkness of initiation, every heartbeat, every flicker of torchlight, every whisper became magnified, producing an intensity of awareness that few outside the cult could survive without transformation. Those who emerged from these rituals were never the same. They had glimpsed a reality where mortality, morality, and divinity converged in ways that defied ordinary understanding. The allure of these secret cults lay precisely in their forbidden nature. While Roman law, morality, and social expectations sought to regulate behavior and belief, the shadow cults offered an alternative, a world where the most extreme human experiences were sanctified, not condemned. Sexual acts, blood offerings, nocturnal devotion, all the elements that society deemed dangerous or immoral, became tools for spiritual transcendence. Initiates were drawn by curiosity, by fear, by desire, and by the intoxicating promise of hidden knowledge. The very acts that inspired horror in outsiders became, within the cult, pathways to enlightenment. By embracing transgression, the participants discovered a form of devotion that was immediate, visceral, and irreversible. This transgression was not reckless indulgence. It was structured, ritualized, and psychologically calculated. Each act, each test, each encounter with fear or ecstasy was orchestrated to maximize spiritual and emotional transformation. Darkness, secrecy, and extremity were not merely atmospheric. They were essential instruments of ritual. In these ceremonies, the body became sacred, the mind a crucible, and the soul a vessel capable of containing terrifying truths. Initiates experienced life and death, pleasure and horror, order and chaos, all in a single moment of ritual intensity. Through this convergence, the ordinary self was stripped away, leaving only raw awareness, raw devotion, and an intimate connection with forces that lay beyond mortal comprehension. The cult's emphasis on fear, secrecy, and ritualized transgression reveals a profound understanding of human psychology. Initiates were taught to confront and transcend the limitations of ordinary consciousness. The interplay of terror and ecstasy, shame and awe, vulnerability and courage, created a mental and emotional state in which the divine was palpable. The boundaries between self and God, human and divine, ordinary and extraordinary, dissolved. Every initiation, every act of devotion, every encounter with the sacred darkness, forced participants to navigate extremes that most people spend a lifetime avoiding. The psychological resilience developed in this crucible became both a spiritual tool and a survival mechanism within the dangerous, clandestine environment of the cult. The shadow cults also explored the human relationship with mortality in ways that the public temples never dared. Death was not an abstract inevitability. It was a constant, immediate presence within rituals. Symbolic deaths, through confinement, simulated sacrifices, and encounters with blood and mortality forced initiates to confront the fragility of life. By experiencing fear and mortality in controlled yet extreme circumstances, participants learned to embrace existence itself, to perceive its sacredness, and to recognize the thin veil between life and the unknown. This confrontation with death, terrifying as it was, became a cornerstone of the cult's philosophy. Salvation and enlightenment could not be achieved without first grappling with the ultimate human fear. Sexuality, too, played a central role in this exploration of human extremity. Within the confines of ritual, sexual acts were elevated into symbols of cosmic principles, divine union, and moral transgression. These acts, performed in darkness, often with symbolic gestures or role reversals, forced initiates to confront desire, shame, and devotion simultaneously. Pleasure became a tool of insight, transgression a medium of communion, and intimacy a conduit to the divine. The intertwining of fear, ecstasy, and sacredness amplified psychological intensity, producing experiences that defied conventional morality but provided profound spiritual insight. The body became an altar, and each act, whether violent, intimate, or ritualized, was imbued with sacred significance. Blood offerings, whether from animals, symbolic substitutes, or rare human sacrifices, further intensified the sacred power of these rituals. Blood, as the life force, was understood to connect mortals with the divine. The shedding of blood was a reminder of fragility, a confrontation with mortality, and a gift to forces beyond comprehension. The act of giving, whether symbolic or literal, required courage, devotion, and complete surrender. The psychological effect was overwhelming. Fear became devotion, horror became insight, and the physical act of sacrifice transformed into a bridge between human limitation and divine eternity. Secrecy amplified every aspect of these cults' power. Initiates existed in a constant tension between exposure and concealment. The fear of discovery heightened the intensity of every ritual, making each moment charged with risk and significance. Social, legal, and moral threats transformed ordinary acts into extraordinary experiences. Secrecy created intimacy, intensified devotion, and reinforced psychological and spiritual transformation. In this environment, darkness was not merely a backdrop. It was an active participant in the cultivation of awe, fear, and transcendence. Ultimately, the shadow cults of Rome were a study in extremes, a meditation on the human psyche, and an exploration of the sacred through the forbidden. They reveal the depths to which humans will venture to access knowledge, power, and communion with forces beyond the ordinary. Their rituals, terrifying as they were instruments of profound transformation, tools for confronting mortality, desire, fear, and the limitations of self. The lessons of these cults extend far beyond their historical moment, offering insight into the enduring human fascination with the unknown, the forbidden, and the extreme. Even today, the echoes of these cults resonate. They linger in stories of secret societies, in the thrill of transgression, and in humanity's fascination with the terrifying and the forbidden. The shadow cults of Rome remind us that the search for meaning, power, and the divine often leads into darkness, that salvation may lie in what society condemns, and that true insight sometimes requires embracing fear, transgression, and the unknown. Their legacy is a mirror to the human condition. To encounter the divine, one must be willing to confront the shadows within and without, to transgress, to fear, and ultimately, to awaken. In the end, Rome's shadow cults leave us with a haunting truth. The boundaries of morality, fear, and devotion are not fixed, and the path to enlightenment is rarely gentle. Those who walked the hidden corridors of their temples, who embraced blood, darkness, and terror, discovered a reality that was both sublime and terrifying. Their story challenges us to consider the extremes of human nature, the depths of spiritual courage, and the enduring power of the forbidden. And perhaps, in that darkness, we glimpse not only the secrets of ancient Rome but the uncharted, shadowed recesses of our own souls, where fear, awe, and the sacred converge in a single, unforgettable experience.